So hello everyone, welcome again to those of you who are joining in live or those of you who are listening offline at a later time. Welcome to this next episode of Meet the meQuanics. This one's a bit of a different kind of episode. I'm joined again by Jared Cole from RMIT University in Australia, who was on one of our earlier episodes. And we're doing this episode today to help promote a new consultancy firm that Jared and I have recently launched. Called HBAR Consultants, that is set up hopefully in order to interact strongly with the private sector in order to help facilitate investment and help facilitate the development of quantum technology. So Jared, thanks again for giving us a bit of your time.
Thank you very much. Pleasure as always.
So as usual with our harebrained ideas, we came up with this in the pub.
Yes, it wouldn't be the first one. Hopefully not the last.
Yeah, certainly. And it's kind of evolved pretty much from the realization that I've said in a lot of these podcasts that quantum technology has now become more of a private sector thing. There's more investment that seems to be showing up from either big tech firms or even smaller startups. And this is no longer simply an academic endeavor.
Absolutely, and one of the, we constantly hear, particularly from a government level, that there's this big gap between the university sector and the private sector. It's very difficult to take an experiment done in the lab and turn it into a real product. This is certainly much worse with quantum technology, just because the learning curve is so steep with all these new concepts and what has been relatively obscure physics, essentially, and engineering suddenly becoming at the forefront because it's in all of these new devices and new technology. And hopefully we can help bridge that gap.
Well, yeah, that's the biggest thing is people just aren't trained in this kind of stuff. Your undergraduate, you did engineering? Communications engineering.
Yeah, I did communications engineering and physics. And so, that's actually an interesting point. The engineering degrees, particularly as a scientist, it's a bit interesting that engineers these days are taught about commercialization and the product life cycle and administration of large projects and all of these kind of things right from day one. We had subjects even in first year which were all about design and innovation and how to market a product and how to go through the patent process and all of it and protecting IP and all of these issues, because this is very much what engineering is about these days. It's the division between what scientists do and engineering does has grown over time as engineering as a field, particularly electronic and computer and modern technology engineering has grown as a field. It's almost all growth towards the business end. Mm-hmm. So what was done scientifically in engineering firms 40 years ago and what is done now is kind of the same level of technical detail, but the management end and the business end has grown over time because there's no point in having this wonderful product if you can't market it correctly and if you can't get investment for the product.
Was that a unique thing to RMIT, or is this pretty much standard across the board for engineering?
It seems to be fairly common across engineering, but RMIT, because it's a technical university, is kind of very focused on this. We have the engineering degrees that in Melbourne, both RMIT and Swinburne have this focus where the students spend a lot of time working with companies and working on real-world products and discussing market pathways and all these kind of things, as well as just learning how to solve integrals and how to wire up PCB boards and all that kind of stuff. So I think it is common across all of modern engineering, but the technical universities tend to have a very strong focus on this because they're talking about employing engineers or making employable engineers. So this is a big part of it. If you look at the career structure of a typical engineer, they're almost always in management by their 40s. There's very few engineers who are doing technical stuff on the ground level once they get into their 40s. So you may as well train them for that stuff at the start, because if you have to learn management techniques when you're 40, it's not going to work nearly as well as if you learn them in your 20s and then go to develop it over time.
But I think, imaginally they don't do any of this sort of high-level quantum stuff.
Yeah, and this is the big thing that's changing is that, electrical engineering became a proper profession kind of around the First World War, and I think the other example I was talking about the other day was nuclear engineering, which became a profession in the 50s and 60s.
Mm-hmm.
And before then, just scientists and physicists. Of course, nuclear physics is only from the 30s onwards. But there's this point where the product, it goes from research to product. And at the same time, suddenly you have to teach people to build the things and teach people to implement them rather than discover them. And I really am quite optimistic that we've about hit this crossover with quantum technology as well, in that the existing engineering degrees don't have enough of the fundamental principles that are necessary to understand how these technologies work. And so as the products are more developed and as the market expands, we're going to end up with quantum engineering schools, the same as we have electrical engineering schools, nuclear engineering schools, and all that kind of stuff.
Well, it's already started. I mean, Bristol's got their doctoral training centre on quantum engineering, and Oxford's got a DTC that's supposed to be related to quantum engineering as well, and I think Delft's doing stuff. And
Yep, yeah. And it's interesting that we're seeing it being driven initially by the physics departments, usually. Because this idea that, I mean, this is why they're doctoral training centres rather than engineering schools, because at the moment it's clear that people need this training, but which products they're going to need to be working with are a bit unclear, because they're still niche markets and it hasn't broadened out into a proper field. But eventually I can see most of this stuff just moving across into a more engineering focus. As soon as the biggest concern you have is whether this product is going to fail in 2 years' time, rather than whether it's going to work at all at the start. As soon as you cross over into this maintenance and failure rates and marketability and cost per unit, that's when engineers come in, because that's what they do really well.
So, I mean, there's plenty of quantum physicists in engineering departments. I mean, Andrea, for example, up at UNSW, he runs all of his efforts out of engineering. He doesn't run it out of physics.
Yeah, that's right.
And as far as I can tell, except for sort of his interaction within the centre and the centre interactions that he has, he doesn't talk to physics much.
Yeah, there does seem to be a bit of that. I mean, of course, there is different cultures. So, I mean, we've got Alberto here who's in an engineering department, but I would call what he does physics, and I would say the way he approaches things is physics. But, I mean, he works on single photon devices on chip, etc. And I would say this is one of the technologies that's very close to full commercialization. And eventually, photonics engineers will deal with all of that. And very few physicists need to be involved necessarily, because there'll be certain rules written down that were developed by the physics community, but at some point it will become, these are the boxes you put together, this box does that, this box does that, and you put them all together. I mean, systems engineering is how we have such complicated things.
I mean, how much training would need to be required in this kind of stuff? I mean, you would need to have some at least you'd have to have the background knowledge of quantum mechanics. You have to have the background knowledge of quantum mechanics.
I think this is one of the reasons at the moment you need quite extensive training in quantum physics, is that you need to have everything at your fingertips at the moment. But over time, I think it'll probably be specialised. The classic example I have is when I was studying engineering, I did a subject on satellite communications, and we were calculating signal strengths. So you send a signal up to a satellite, and it's received, amplified, and sent back down again. Mm-hmm. And the question is, how much power does a satellite require? So you do all these link load calculations where you calculate how much energy is lost on the way up, and the amplifier strength up the top, and everything in the whole link. And there's this enormous equation with all these weird number factors in it and everything else. And you put in the frequency in gigahertz, the distance to the satellite in kilometers, and 2 other parameters, and you get out a number. Mm-hmm. And the physicist in me was horrified, because what it actually is solving Maxwell's equations for the fact that you send a signal and it has some width, which it spreads out as a function of distance. And then there's a cross-sectional area with the receiver and the satellite, which means you lose some fraction of the total signal. And then, of course, there's a drop in signal strength, and then an increase again once you go through the amplifier stage. And there's all these beautiful physics, which someone had done all those calculations and boiled it down to this really simple formula. But the point is that engineers use this one formula all day, every day. And so those engineers, although we had classes in electromagnetics and all those kind of things, on their day-to-day calculations, they don't actually need to do all these things, because all those messy integrals and polar coordinates and all that other stuff is a source of error. Because what if you fuck up one of the steps in the process? So you want to make the process as simple as possible by throwing out all the extraneous information. I mean, you don't need to deal with the fact that near a black hole, the signal will be bent slightly, and therefore there will be a loss mechanism, because it's just never going to happen. But physicists care about that very much. They care about the general approach. And so I can see this process eventually happening in quantum engineering as well, is that there'll be particular cases where there are much of the theory is boiled down to just the bits that they need, and they won't learn everything. But we're a long way from that. Right now, we don't know. So that's why it's so important to have people trained in all of quantum physics, as well as working on this quantum technology stuff. And this, I think, leads to this big gap between what the scientists know and what business needs to know, which hopefully we can bridge this gap.
Well, I mean, that's the whole point. I mean, we've had some conversations already with various people from the physics side that have sort of been interested in what HBAR is going to do and stuff like that. But I mean, when you and I talked about it, we certainly thought of us coming more, interacting more with the business side rather than interacting with the physicists, or at the very least providing some kind of conduit in order to help get the business talking to the physicists, with sort of us acting as sort of impartial mediators.
Hopefully, yeah. That's the plan.
Well, I mean, we put it on some of our videos that's on our website. The fact that neither of us are particularly attached to any centre, any system, although that's changed recently for you. You're now attached to the Centre for Exciton Science or something, right?
Yeah, the ARC Centre for Exciton Science. Although I should point out that there's no quantum computing in that centre, and depending on how it goes, no quantum technology. Actually, my interest there is more, so excitonic transport is very important in things like photosynthesis and artificial photosynthesis and all of these at the boundary between electronics and biology. And that's actually my interest in that area. So hopefully, at least the plan is that this will be just something else I do rather than impinging on my quantum technology.
Well, I mean, this kind of stuff, as we've always discussed, I mean, it is sort of quantum technology. It is exploiting active quantum mechanics in order to build interesting technological devices.
Oh, look, if I come up with a new design for an artificial photosynthesis system that looks like it's actually going to work well and be more efficient than what's out there, I'll be ecstatic, and I will definitely be talking about the quantum technology ramifications of it.
I don't think we need to worry about keeping HBAR going if you figured out a highly revolutionary and efficient way of doing photosynthesis and energy conversion.
That's low probability of success, but high reward, I guess.
Yeah, I think
that's
so.
The point.
But I mean, the business side of it, I mean, I think Australia's probably a bit more advanced at this than Japan is at the moment. Surprisingly, Japan hasn't had that much private sector interest in quantum tech. I mean, in the early days, places like NEC were involved. They had quantum labs, but they shut all their stuff down. And I mean, Hitachi and Toshiba have got research efforts, but their research efforts are mainly based out of the UK. And from what I understand, especially with Toshiba and Hitachi, that, sort of their divisions never meet. I mean, yes, they're all Toshiba and they're all Hitachi, but, Hitachi Japan doesn't really play that much of an influence on what Hitachi UK does.
Yeah, I find this a bit strange, because often Japan is the prototype example of how commercialization of technology should happen, because there is such a good link in Japan between fundamental research through to applied research through to product development. I mean, we've got so many good examples. The most famous one, of course, is the blue LED.
Yeah, from the Nobel a couple of years ago.
And so, of course, Japan was at the leading edge of that technology because they developed it, and it was all done in these labs. And I mean,
Nakamura, I think it was Nakamura, the guy who was in the private sector at the time, who won the Nobel on this. He only got $200 for that. But he ended up suing. I can't remember the name of the company that he was working for at the time, but he ended up with quite a long, protracted legal battle. Because they basically gave him $200 for inventing the blue LED.
Yeah, well,
I mean, there's always that part of Japanese business. It's also a bit restrictive of innovation. But I mean, I've mentioned it before with when I moved to Japan nearly 10 years ago. You know, this was sort of the year the iPhone was released.
Yep.
And before the iPhone was released, you know, you'd come to Japan and you'd have all these cell phones that were manufactured by SoftBank and NTT, and they were always far better than what we used to have. You know, they were far better than the Nokias and the Ericssons that we'd end up getting in Australia. And then that completely collapsed just about the second that Apple came out with the iPhone and Samsung started developing theirs.
Yeah. And the same thing with Nokia. I mean, Nokia collapsed overnight because of the same problem.
Yes. And I don't know, it's kind of the fact that Japan just doesn't seem to be interested from the private sector side so far in quantum tech is bizarre to me, considering their history with electronics. The only ones who are really doing it with any seriousness is NTT.
Yeah, I mean, NTT's got a very good presence in that space. But...
Well, they've still got a mandate because they used to be government-owned, and then they became privatized in the 70s or 80s, I think. They've still got a government mandate for doing basic research. And, I mean, that's what BRL is, you know, they're basic research labs. And then they've got a completely other divisions for research that are more applicable to this. Like, for example, as far as I'm aware, their BRL labs don't do research into next-gen cell phone networks because it's far more applicable to, you know, current market needs and current income sources of NTT. So I'd say it's done in other divisions. And BRL is really responsible for this, I think, government mandate side of things. But Australia, on the other hand, you know, they've taken a much better lead on this, at least from the private side, when it comes to, you know, Telstra getting involved, CBA, the Commonwealth Bank getting involved.
Yeah, even then, this is a kind of a funny. This is very promising, but it's a bit unclear what the lead up to this was. So it's a bit unclear how to repeat this for other branches. So the background here, of course, is that the Centre for Quantum Computing. The Centre for Quantum Computing and Communication Technology.
They're going to change their name again, that they've got renewed again?
No, I believe it's still the same acronym.
Okay, good. Well, that's difficult enough.
Yeah. Their logo's nice, though. It's pretty much the same logo. It's from the old days. But anyway, It's just a photo in it now. So I mean, they've just been in the same round that this Exostom Centre and some other things that some other centres were funded. They were refunded, and this is kind of demonstration of the Australian government's long-term support and funding for quantum computing, and it has put the silicon quantum computing effort in Australia at the forefront of what is being done worldwide for silicon. There's still, I mean, it depends which architectures you're talking about, and this is kind of the subtlety behind the field, is knowing which architectures are doing what and what their big challenges are. But in silicon quantum computing, they are certainly at the front. But of course, and so this is this discovery research projects that are meant to do fundamental science over a long period of time. They're 7 years worth of funding. They're big operations, usually 15 to 20 key investigators in the project. And this is what's driven since I think the Special Research Centre started in 1999. So since then, they've been working in this area. And
yeah, I mean, it's existed ever since I was even in undergrad.
Yeah. So I think the Special Research Centre came first, and then there's been 3 centres of excellence since then. And you see the results. I mean, you see what happens when you invest 24 years, well, now it's 17 years, it will be 24 by the end, of worth of funding at this level in this one project. This is how we get to the front of the field. But what's really interesting is this new movement from the government and from, as you mentioned, Telstra and the Commonwealth Bank of Australia to fund the translation. So this is funding directly to go from the lab to products. And this is a very encouraging sign because, of course, this is the missing piece of the puzzle that we haven't had so far. Of course, it will, at the moment, very little information is public, so we don't know exactly what their plans are and how they're going to do it. But when you put something like $50 million in just for this translation, on top of the $35 million that you put in for the fundamental research. I mean, it's quite clear that there are very few other operations in the world at that scale. I mean, the Google development project for superconducting quantum computing is probably one of the only other few ones on that same scale.
Oh, the Chinese. Definitely the Chinese.
Yeah. So the Chinese in general, but do they have one central project, or is that a more diverse?
Well, it depends on how you'd want to talk about it. I mean, I spoke with Daniel the other week about his CubeSat thing that he was doing with the Singaporeans.
Yep.
And I didn't realize this because you read about the Chinese launch.
Yep.
Quantum launch. I didn't know this at the time. It's a dedicated satellite.
Well, it's just one satellite for that purpose.
Yeah, Zhang Wei Pan put an optics bench in space, basically.
Wow, nice. Yeah,
So
I mean,
it's something like $100 million for him to put that into space.
Wow. Okay, then yeah, I take that back. That is by far one of the bigger projects. Yeah.
And then I can't remember where I saw it. There was an article that this Beijing to Shanghai QKD link is just about finished or something like that. I mean, the Chinese are powering ahead, and you know, it seems like every university within China has got some quantum tech department.
Yeah, I know. I mean, physics in China in general is just going in leaps and bounds. I mean, when almost every other country in the world, developed country in the world, is cutting back on their fundamental science, China is just pouring buckets and buckets of money into it because they understand the long-term ramifications of this. I mean, this is how Germany got to the front. This is how America got to the front. And now it's China's turn.
Yeah, well, they just invited me. A guy's a professor at the University of Cincinnati, but he's Chinese and he also has a position, I can't remember, one of the biggest cities in China. Invited me early next month to go give a talk on quantum computing. And, I mean, they just basically said, oh, look, just get a visa and we'll handle everything else. This is just the way that the Chinese do it. If you come visit us, we'll handle your flights, we'll handle your accommodations, we'll handle per diems, all of that. Just get a visa. Yeah,
so I mean, we've got several international partners in the Centre for Exciton Science in China, and they actually chipped in cash as part of their contribution. Where usually, there's a standard phrase in science where it's very hard to get money to cross borders. Mm-hmm. You can apply for money within a country, but it's very difficult to apply to another country's funding agency for money for your own research. The American defence is one of the few counterexamples, but by and large, if you're in the EU, you can apply for EU funding. If you're out of the EU, you can't. And the Chinese actually contributed significant cash contributions to the Centre for Exciton Science. And I believe, so there's another centre here at RMIT, the Centre for Nanoscale Biophotonics, and they've also got very serious Chinese partners, just because there's serious science going on, and it's seen as, if you can be involved in that, then...
well, funnily enough, when I visited Hong Kong University, they all complained ad nauseum about the fact that they couldn't touch money in mainland China.
Yeah, I think the boundary between those two is chosen depending on the situation and the...
Yeah, I mean, there seemed to be, you know, a great firewall of funding between the special regions and mainland China that they just can't go through. And obviously this hurts them because Hong Kong is rich, but it's not a tech-rich region. It's now a financial hub. And that's where they get their wealth from. They don't have a huge amount of tech investment. But, you know, I'd like to think that HBAR could, you know, get access to some of that Chinese money, but considering it's all state-run, I seem to think that's probably not going to happen.
Well, at the end of the day, I mean, if we do our job properly, what we will end up doing is helping people put the money in the right places. I mean, helping make an informed decision about these things. I don't expect to make much money out of it, but helping the technology develop to the point where people do make money out of it is at least one of my goals. I guess.
Well, I mean, certainly, we're certainly not setting up HBAR in order to, you know, produce hardware. That's for sure.
It's absolutely not.
Well, obviously, you know, first of all, neither of us think it's quite there yet. For hardware startups, you know, especially ones that don't have significant money behind them. I mean, the Googles and the IBMs of this world are fine. They've got deep pockets and other divisions to help support quantum, but startups would be pretty tricky. Although, Rigetti's doing quite well, from what I can tell.
Yeah.
They seem to be pushing ahead. Of course, being private, they don't leak too much until they want you to know what they're building and what they're doing. But they're still hiring, and as far as I can tell, they've got quite a significant 15 or 20 people, maybe even more now.
Ooh, so that's
at various levels. So, I don't know how much money Chad's got behind him in terms of total investment or what kind of time frame he's putting on things. I've tried to get him on the podcast a couple of times, but he said no. It's one of the more disappointing things about this stuff slowly moving out of academia is that now we can't get any information about stuff. We see the stuff that comes out of Google, but honestly, I don't know what they're doing internally. And when I talk to people at Google, they're very tight-lipped.
Yeah, John wasn't too bad. Last month I was at a conference. So the background is that one of the projects I work on is this getting rid of defects in aluminium oxide, which is kind of a boring technical material science problem that's existed for 30 or 40 years. But suddenly it's one of the limiting factors for Google's quantum computer. And so we had a very specialised conference about a month ago on exactly this topic, and John Martinez was there, and he was talking about their developments, and he was pretty forthright about where they are at and what they want to do. But of course, it's a commercial operation, so you never know whether what he's telling you is just the boundary he's prepared to talk about or not. But it seemed pretty clear where they were at, and the story wasn't any dissimilar to what we've heard publicly. So.
But it's more so that, if they solve any of these problems, whether it's the material science side, the experimental side, or even the theory side, the software side, odds are you're not going to know.
Yes and no. At least...
Or maybe you won't know the details. They might leak out that, we've solved this problem, but you're not going to figure out how they solved it.
Well, that might be true later on, but right now, Google are in, of course, the distinct advantage that they are, in terms of fully coherent quantum computing, so far in front of a lot of other stuff. So that they've been very forthright. So he's actually publishing quite a lot of their designs and their specs, and they've been quite open at the moment. Now, of course, this can always be pulled back at a later stage, but we saw, he talked about in terms of coherence and fidelity, they've made advances of factors of 5 and factors of 10, kind of on what was done 2 years ago. And he was very forthright about exactly what they'd done, etc. Just because it's so complicated and there are many steps that even if he tells someone tomorrow, it would take them another 2 years to get to where they are now. And of course, they're not still. I think as soon as their technology stabilizes, and so all of their work is going from a full prototype into an actual commercial product, that stage will probably be almost completely hidden from public view. But at the moment, they're still getting to as many qubits as possible with as high fidelity as possible. And they've just got such a head start on everyone else that they can be completely free with their information.
Maybe it's just Austin when I speak to him.
It might be, but of course, Austin isn't the boss.
Yeah.
So John and Austin have very different freedom in terms of what they disclose and what they don't. And so John can talk about the material science and the problems they have solved and the problems they still have quite freely because he knows the big picture, where Austin has to, he's got his special area and he has an overview over the whole project, but that doesn't mean that he's completely free to give away or to make a decision about what a secret is and what not.
That's a fair point.
And I should say that John told us almost nothing about the algorithmic side and the control. And so all, because the whole focus was material science, and essentially it was 15 or 20 of the world experts on this topic and me, and they basically were all together to discuss the same problems. And he basically showed us what things they already know how to fix and what things they don't, basically to help us focus on the unknown problems rather than the known problems that we just don't have the technology where they do. And so this is an important thing where he gets something out of it as well, because he helps focus the worldwide effort on the problems that really are true material science and physics problems versus just fancy engineering. There's lots of fancy fabrication engineering problems that they have already solved that most other labs in the world haven't yet. But that's just a matter of time and money. the more fundamental material science problems are common to everyone, and he wants solutions to them. So, of course, yeah, it makes sense to talk about them openly.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be interesting to see, especially in the hardware side, whether or not that turns into a plethora, or how long it takes for there to turn into a plethora of companies. I mean, as you said, there's such a steep learning curve, both in just to get familiarity with quantum technology, which is kind of the stuff that we hope to do with this consultancy firm. But also, if you decide that, okay, we're going to start building this stuff, there's a steep learning curve to get the tech right.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, if you want to start a superconducting quantum computing lab that's going to compete with John Martinez or the guys at IBM, not only do you have to be very heavily invested, but you're probably going to have to hire guys that used to work for them.
Yeah. And this is, I mean, you can already see this with IBM and Google and D-Wave. Because, of course, scientifically, there's still big arguments and discussion about what the D-Wave machine actually does and what is its point and how useful it is or not and all these kind of things. But a very important point about the D-Wave machine is they've solved a lot of the engineering problems that all quantum computers are going to have to solve anyway. All companies that build quantum computers are going to have to solve. They have got, whatever you call them, whether they're bits or qubits or some weird combination of qubits and bits or whatever, they are two-level systems that are controllable, and they have coupling between them that are controllable. That's fairly clear. But they have got all of the wires and control leads and
no, it's all in a self-contained box. They've got helium recycling. They've got the control computers all hooked up. I mean, they're just a box.
Yeah, and it's clear that all of those problems, and Google and IBM don't know how D-Wave has solved all of those problems. They've got plenty of information and guesses, but they don't have all of the specs and all the details of D-Wave's machine.
Well, Paul Warburton from UCL visited us a couple of weeks ago. I don't know if it was before your visit or after when you came to Japan. But he's been quite heavily involved in figuring out what the D-Wave system's doing and the experiments that they do at USC and Google. And he says that when they put the box together, they do 2 stages of calibration. So they calibrate before the machine leaves D-Wave in Canada. Then they basically ship the box, they assemble it at NASA or at USC or wherever it's going. And then it's something like a 2 or 3 week calibration cycle. And then that has to be repeated every time that they heat up the fridge and then cool it down again. But luckily, I think he said the USC machine, it was either the University of Southern California machine or the Google machine, has been running without being reheated for a year or 2 or some quite long period of time. And the guys at IBM with their quantum experience, them too, they don't reheat the machine.
Yeah, and I mean, the dilution refrigeration technology, we know that once it gets down below, say, 100 millikelvin, everything is very stable. And I mean, it's not unusual in labs all around the world for these experiments to sit there for months, if not years. And many papers and many experiments are conducted on the same chip. Usually the reason that a fridge is brought up to room temperature and back down again is because you want to change the experiment, because you want to do it better, you want to put new control lines in, or you want to change the chip. But the technology itself, particularly recently we moved, so the last 5 to 10 years, we moved to what's called a dry fridge. So a dilution refrigerator works because they've got a combination of helium-3 and helium-4, which are the 2 isotopes of helium, either 2 neutrons or 1 neutron in the nucleus. And the way they mix, there's this really cool effect where you basically can do refrigeration by using a mixture of them, and then they're separated and mix them again in the cycle. And the old fridges, you had to keep, the helium-3 was a closed cycle, but the helium-4 had to be continued pouring in. And so one of the first trips I ever came to see you in Japan, I went to NEC's lab, and they had this enormous fridge. Like, it was big enough for me to stand in the outer casing. And they just had to pour litres and litres of liquid helium into it every day just to keep the thing cold. But now they've got to this point where both the helium-3 and helium-4 are completely closed cycle. So the fridge really turns up from the company, you plug it in, of course there's a lot of calibration and other stuff, and then you press a button, and a day later, you've got a metal plate about this big. The whole metal plate is sitting at 50 millikelvin, which I still find astonishing. I mean, it's hot. I mean, minus 273, 72 degrees is quite amazing for a big piece of metal like this. And so then you put your sample on all of that, and it cools the whole sample down and everything works. Once you get down to that temperature, as long as the power continues to be running, and so you have UPS systems and all that kind of stuff, then the thing can sit at that temperature for however long you like. But certainly because of the, particularly in superconducting devices, because of the nature of the materials involved, as soon as you cycle it up to room temperature and back down again, or even up to say 1 Kelvin and back down again, all of the energy levels shift and the frequencies shift, and that's why you have to redo this calibration every time. This is just a factor of the fundamental material science of what's going on.
Do you think that that's, I mean, this is obviously going to create problems later down the track for the engineers and for any kind of commercial adaptation of these things, at least say maybe at a consumer level. I mean, most people are assuming that the quantum technology or quantum computers specifically are going to be cloud-based devices before anything else. But I mean, for this to be ending up being a consumer-based thing, you know, these ideas about refrigeration and cycling the system, these have to be solved. But from the material science standpoint, is there any hope, or is it these systems are just too fragile when it comes to temperature?
There is hope from a material science point of view. I mean, one of the obvious solutions to this problem that I work on, this problem of defects in the metal oxide, is to get rid of the oxide. And so there have been certainly plenty of work on doing everything out of single crystal structures, which don't have as many problems. But cooling and operating an electronic device at 50 millikelvin or 20 millikelvin is still very difficult. And I assume it probably won't be solved. I think they'll just have very optimized cooling and calibration routines and very efficient ways of dealing with this. So the analogy I use is, so I use a lot of time on the national supercomputer, the National Computational Infrastructure, NCI.
Is this NICTA?
No, NICTA, that's a different one.
I'm losing track of all of these. If it's anything except the CSIRO, I've lost track of them.
Yeah, so NCI is the major computational facility that most computational physicists or computational scientists in Australia use. And so in the world stage, it's not right up there, but I think it's still in the top 50 or top 100, something like that. But anyway, it's a cloud-based solution, not a cloud-based, it's a centralized solution. We all tunnel into it from our machines and run jobs on it. And that's completely classical. By world standards, it's rather boring kind of interlinked cluster supercomputing technology. If they have a problem, even once the machine is ready to go, it still takes up to a day to get everything back up and running, because they have to bring things up slowly and different hard drive stacks have to be tested, and this has to be tested and that has to be tested. They had a hilarious situation a couple of years ago. Maybe not hilarious for them, but for us. There was some substation or transformer problem, and it literally blew out the power supply in the supercomputer. So they have this picture of the thing that's just blown up because something shorted or spiked or whatever, and it just shut the whole thing down, and it took them ages. There were a couple of key components got fried, and they had to identify them and replace them, and it was days before the thing came up. But even besides that, they still have a maintenance cycle where every quarter the machine is down for 8 hours or something while they do all this maintenance. And then they bring it up again slowly, and then everyone puts their jobs back on, and away we go. I can easily foresee that a working quantum computer will have a similar life cycle where every 3 months or every 6 months you have to power the machine down, do a whole bunch of maintenance, and as part of that, you'll also redo all of the calibration. So the fact that the calibration at the moment takes 2 to 3 days, I think can be brought down considerably.
Well, the calibration and the D-Wave system, that's MP hard. I mean, there's just no efficient solution for this.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean we can't have better heuristic solutions, because that's how we do all testing at the moment. We just
sure.
And so over time, they will begin to know which parts of the calibration tend to slide over time and which parts don't. If you cycle up to 1K or you cycle up to room temperature, different parameters will shift by different amounts, and you know where the parameters were before. So you can optimize your search space to just get faster calibration. So I have no problem with that. The next question, which we were kind of intimating to, is if we're talking about smaller scale, does a university department have a quantum computer, or does a rich person have one in his lounge room?
Well, I was going to say, I think this is where technological diversity is, because I can imagine optical computers working at that level.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there are some serious advantages to optical computers in this space. Anything that doesn't require sub 1 Kelvin.
Or vacuum.
Or vacuum, has a considerable advantage. But of course, in terms of the race between all the architectures, what we're talking about now is who's in front and who's behind. So,
well, no, I mean, you and I have always been of the same opinion that this idea of there being a race and there being a winner is just a very damaging way to look at this.
Yeah. Well, there's certainly a race, but I don't think there needs to be a winner because it is damaging. I mean, the way people are behaving at the moment is a race, but I don't think it's the future for quantum technology. I
mean, one of the videos that we did for HBAR, I mean, this is one of the things that you alluded to in terms of what we want to do with this is to try and point certain businesses in the right direction, as to say, okay, what do you ultimately want out of this? Do you want to be an investment partner for a large lab? Are you interested in this for certain applications in the future? Do you just want training? Your technical departments. I've heard rumors that a lot of the services that people like EBA or Telstra might want out of this is related to a lot to do with training at this point. And obviously, to get their foot in the door for the Australian technology that's being built. But I can imagine, places like, especially banks or any kind of these financial institutions that do run these high-frequency trading models, that to have their own internal divisions being trained up on what quantum computers can do, or at least the theory side of it, is advantageous because they don't want to outsource a lot of these models.
Yeah, that's right. And they need to know, I mean, any technology at the start is often driven by hype, and you need to get under that hype and find out what is going on and what's short-term and what's mid-term and what's long-term.
Quantum computing has had so much of that.
Yeah, that's right. It's the broad brushstrokes, we're going to build computers that work better and faster than everything that's gone before, is very seductive, particularly from a funding point of view, but it's much more nuanced than that.
Also from a PR point of view, with all the stuff that you see coming out in newspapers and stuff, I struggle to think of another area of science, maybe stuff to do with genetics. I mean, this CRISPR stuff that's happening in biology, this technique for selective editing of genes. I sort of see it as being similar to quantum computing as to the hype. Now, I'm not an expert in that field, so I can only assume that they're getting as many things wrong. When it comes to CRISPR and biology, as I've seen people get things wrong about quantum technology. Yeah,
that's right. The human ingenuity and genius is one extreme, and there's always the opposite end, and everyone in between, and you have to take this into account.
Well, I've seen it happen a couple of times with articles on our work. You'll get interviewed for a place like, I don't know, like New Scientist or something like that. You'll get interviewed and the journalist will speak to you directly. And, if they're good, they'll pretty fairly represent what you say and try hard not to exaggerate yourself. But then I see it happen that news outlets then pick up from that interview. And they've always got to put a new spin. They've always got to put a new angle. So they'll elaborate. They won't necessarily contact you and get better quotes or have a discussion with you, or even contact any other physicists. They'll just start churning out a different explanation. You can sort of see, it's like this telephone thing. Each step, everything gets degraded.
Purple monkey dishwasher.
Yeah, and I think it'd be a very good rule for people to start learning is that the number of hops you need to get from the article you're reading back to the direct source for that article tells you exactly how bad that article is.
Certainly. I know
hops to get there, then you're pretty much guaranteed that the article's probably full of rubbish.
Yeah, I noticed particularly because your work tends to have much more of something for the media to hold on to than my stuff. So I often read your articles and go, I read that paper. I'm pretty sure that's not what they actually said.
Yeah, it's happened a couple of times, but you're right. I mean, my stuff's a little bit more digestible.
Well, Sometimes. I'm confused by your papers, a lot of your papers, but yeah. But I think that it captures the public's imagination more.
Mm.
I tend to pick problems for myself that are difficult problems we need to solve, but are difficult to explain to the layperson why they're a difficult problem that need to be solved.
Yeah,
And
I mean,
I'm getting
charge
better at that.
defect movements in aluminium oxide barriers is you can't really spin that.
Yeah. Although when I write ARC grants, the opening paragraph is like, but if we could fix this problem, then this would be faster and this would be better and quantum computers would be glorious and blah, 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 which is of course true. But when you actually get down to the problem that needs to be solved, it's much more boring and technical than that, which is of course what scientists do. I mean, we have to understand the big picture plus the technical details at the bottom.
I mean, have you had much interaction with the business side in, sort of poking its foot in the door, talking about quantum tech? I mean, you mentioned that RMIT now they've got a new centre and they've got the Biophotonics Centre, which has been going on, and now researchers are involved with the Quantum Computing Centre. So, I mean, businesses must be coming in and having chats now and again.
So it depends. I mean, it depends a little bit, this issue of what you call quantum technology. And I mean, I talked in the post about the difference between first and second generation quantum technology. So first generation technology, certainly, you see this all the time. I mean, the Centre for Biophotonics do a lot of work with medical instrument manufacturers because they're doing lots of new ways of sensing things in the body and sensing cancer cells and imaging this, that, and the other, and lots of this kind of very applied medical technology. And much of it is quantum in some form at its base. And their centre has a lot of industrial partners in this space. The one I'm in, the Centre for Exciton Science, and we have industry partners like the Reserve Bank, because if we can produce new materials or compounds or structures that use the creation or annihilation of excitons, so when light interacts with the system, it can, when a material, particularly a semiconductor, for example, light comes in and it can form an exciton, which is a partially bound pair of an electron and a hole, or a pseudo-bound pair. But then this can absorb and emit a photon again. And one of the nice applications is that if you build a structure in a certain way and you look at the photons, you shine light on it and then you look at the photons coming out, you get this very specific signature, which looks like a fingerprint. Well, it's not looks like a fingerprint, but it acts like a fingerprint. And if you don't know how the material was manufactured at the start, it's very difficult to artificially construct this particular signature. Mm-hmm. So it's very difficult to counterfeit. So the Reserve Bank of Australia wants to know anything we can say about new anti-counterfeiting techniques, because the Reserve Bank of Australia are at the forefront worldwide of new counterfeiting measures in banknotes. I mean, we have some of the most advanced banknotes in the world. There's polymer ones, the next generation.
Well, we manufacture them for several countries, don't we?
And I mean, the $5 note we've just changed over. And so this is now the second generation of polymer banknotes, and it has all sorts of features on it. There's many, many different things that identify it as a true Australian currency banknote. And this kind of idea of counterfeiting also extends to the drug companies, because of course drug companies care very much about counterfeit drugs. They usually get a bad reputation because the people talk about in China or India trying to produce cheap copies. And the story is always told, but this means that you price those companies out of the market and therefore they can't give cheap drugs to their people, etc. But the flip side is that you can control the quality of the drug. If you've got two types of drug going through the community, one which is manufactured carefully and properly and works properly, and another one which is slightly different and has terrible side effects, and the public can't tell the difference between the copy and the original, they blame all the side effects on both. Yeah. And this is a big concern for the drug companies. I mean, I don't know if you know, but the story behind thalidomide was that there are two forms of this compound used in thalidomide. And in the initial testing, because of the way they fabricated it, there was only one form. And that's perfectly safe. But when they went to large-scale manufacture, they accidentally created both forms of the drug. And it's this second form, it's to do with left and right chirality. This second form is what caused all the birth defects. Mm-hmm. So Now, of course, the thalidomide got such a bad reputation that that drug can never be sold again, full stop.
Well, it is sold, but it's just sold under a different name.
Yeah, but it's not sold to pregnant women.
No, it's certainly not sold to pregnant women.
Yeah. But the point is, the current scientific research suggests that if they had controlled the chirality of the molecules properly, it would have been completely safe. But this was science that they didn't understand at the time. So you can imagine that another situation like that, some standard drug that is produced by large-scale corporations all around the world, one of these counterfeit companies starts producing that drug and doesn't control the particular shape of the molecule correctly, and suddenly it produces a lot of defects or a lot of bad symptoms. That kills the drug for everyone.
Yeah.
And so quality control and counterfeit control is actually a very important issue for drug companies. And this is something I didn't appreciate until I got into that field, is that they very much care about this. And we're using, for example, quantum dots and other kinds of photoactive molecules, which is this combination of really understanding the molecular structure and how it interacts with light at its most fundamental level, but then turning into real technological applications. So,
no, I mean, this is the aspect of quantum technology that is not simply related to stuff that you hear in the media. It's not quantum computing, and it's not quantum networks. This is, this is active quantum technology, but used in a completely different space.
Yeah, that's right. And
I mean, you sometimes hear a lot about, one of the best theoretical examples, one of the earliest theoretical examples, was related to anti-counterfeiting. It was called quantum money. But it was a much more theoretical endeavor. It was much more, what the laws of physics allow, and this the whole idea behind quantum money is that you can embed an array of quantum states into banknotes, because quantum states can't be copied. You could then read them out and test that the note was fine. But this is like embedding qubits into a banknote. That obviously causes significant technical hurdles. But as you said, in the case of this kind of anti-counterfeiting stuff, this is all passive. This is just, we're going to manufacture a small, I don't know, a wafer or something that then gets embedded into the banknote that you just shine a light onto.
And in terms of the fundamental science, I mean, there is an argument to say this is just a natural extension of chemistry. Over 100, 150 years, we're getting better and better at controlling molecules, but it's also the way we think about and the way we design the molecules. The fundamental concepts of quantum physics and issues of how energy is transported from one part of the molecule to another and how long it lives in one part of the other and all these kind of issues. This is really at the core of both quantum technology and a lot of these very cutting-edge nanotechnology issues. I mean, there's not such a strong distinction these days between nanotechnology and quantum technology. I would say, they overlap. You can't subdivide either of them, but they overlap significantly. And this is what is very exciting about it. Then the irony being, I was thinking about this the other day when we were preparing for the launch, is that, I mean, we've talked about this quite often. Quantum computing is the big goal for quantum technology.
The goal,
yeah. And it's kind of hilarious. For the last, more than 10 years now, you have been a quantum computing optimist and I've been a quantum computing pessimist. And over time, our positions have kind of hardened. But I'm still incredibly optimistic about quantum technology more generally, because I really see things coming. And I also should say I'm losing the battle. I mean, we had this classic discussion just as we finished our PhD, and I'm like, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on quantum computing anymore because I reckon it's all going to die. And you're like, no, it's going to go, yep, going to stay in it for a while. And I mean, here we are. I could never have predicted that Google would have a quantum computing lab, and that IBM would, and that D-Wave would be selling machines. And it's actually...
Yeah, it was certainly back when we had that discussion, that'd be 10 years ago, about what was going to happen to quantum technology in the next 10 years. Yeah, it could have quite easily gone the other way.
Yeah. So it's, I mean, this has made me exceptionally optimistic about quantum technology in every facet of it. So it's still a very exciting time to be in this area.
Well, I mean, that was the whole motivation behind us launching HBAR, is that we do think it is now going to be the right time, at least to sort of set up some kind of place for people to come and try and get a link to the science and get a link to the systems without having to go through, as you said in one of the videos, a center or an organization that's got skin in the game. Certainly because there is this race that exists, whether it's justified or not, everyone's pushing their own system and everyone's bad-mouthing everyone else's systems.
Yeah, and this I don't like. I don't think it's necessary. I mean, this has developed a little bit out of the way competitive funding works, because every grant you get means someone else didn't get that grant. Yeah. And so this has led to this bad mouth in the other systems. And you see very famous people get up at conferences and give very nice talks about their system, apart from the slide they spend bad mouthing the other systems. And most of the content of this slide just demonstrates that they don't understand the other systems.
Yeah, I love visiting experimental groups, especially quantum computing experimental groups, because I remember once I did a sort of a tour of Europe, and I started out visiting a superconducting lab, then went to an ion trapping lab, then went to an optics lab, then went to a quantum dots lab, and every conversation always started the same way. It was half a day's conversation on why the technology I just visited was not good enough. And while this technology is the best. And it was this wonderful little cyclical curve that as I went to each lab, they badmouthed the one beforehand.
And it's only once you visit all those labs and work on all of those systems that you see that there are pros and cons to every single architecture, and that there is some ranking that you could give for all of them on almost any criteria, whether it be how advanced the technology is, the long coherence times, the speed of the gates, the ease of integration, whether it's room temperature or low temperature, whether it's vacuum or not. All of these kind of things, you could rank everything, and the order would never be the same.
No, it's not.
You only get this appreciation when you work across all of those different architectures, and it really aggravates me when people just get up and badmouth all the other systems, therefore demonstrating that they don't understand them properly.
Yeah, no, and sort of jumping between, certainly with the architectures that I've helped develop, jumping between, atom optics and diamond and ion traps and superconductors and optics, you do get an appreciation for it, and especially with the good labs, the people who are developing the best tech, at least behind closed doors, they are very honest about they know where the faults are.
And the biggest behaviour is driven by the grant processes rather than any personal animosity. It's just that as a public face, they have to point out why theirs is so much better than everyone else's. Yeah. And at the end of the day, that's not going to matter. The technology and the market together are going to make this decision for us. We don't need a scientist to push a particular agenda.
No, certainly not. And as the investment gets larger and larger, then the market really will start to sort this stuff out. But certainly in terms of what we want to do, it's more about, I think more about education and providing linkages in certainly as an unbiased way as we possibly can. And I think with you on the material science and the condensed matter side, and me on the qubit side and the architecture side, I think that kind of service is something that people are going to increasingly want. Maybe not now, maybe not next year. But people are starting already to tiptoe into this space, and our community might seem comparatively large considering what we understand and what we know. But you go to an engineering conference, or you go to a hardcore computer science or security conference, and you suddenly realize just how few people are actually educated in quantum tech.
Yeah, absolutely.
Big conference for us would be what, 300?
Yeah, that is a big conference. Yeah.
I went to DAC in San Francisco, and I think that I wouldn't have even estimated what that is. Easily 10,000, probably more. One of the major engineering conferences. I think we need to get the APS March meeting. We need to get every physicist to try and generate those numbers. Not just a certain subfield of it.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so we've pretty much come up against an hour now, so we might leave it at that. Yep. But this was a much more informal conversation today, and just sort of hopefully give people sort of an idea of our thoughts and where we're coming from, if they do want to check out HBAR, if they do want to work with us.
Yep. Absolutely.
So everyone who's listening or watching, thanks again. We'll put links to the HBAR website down below and in the descriptions for all of our feeds for anyone who wants to check it out. It's www.h-bar.com.au. We've tried to put some interesting content on our website, including the meQuanics series, which is now hosted on the H-bar website, and the prototype of the meQuanics game, which is related to optimizing and programming large-scale topological quantum computing, is now also hosted on the H-bar website. For those of you who do want to try and play the game, it is WebGL, so it should work with most browsers now. We had some problems previously. However, it is a prototype. We are aware of the numerous bugs that currently exist. We have actually just signed an agreement to continue development of H-bar with an outside firm, and hopefully we'll be slowly developing this into a more stable gaming release, and hopefully get that out to the public to actually do citizen science sometime in the near future. So Jared, thanks again for sitting down and having a chat, and yeah, both of us will keep updating the website and keep adding new content, and all of our contact information is there if anyone is interested in talking with us or working with us, or having us help them out in investment or anything else related to quantum technology. So Jared, thanks again.
Absolutely, thank you.
Great, and thanks again everyone for tuning in.